California True Crime is a podcast that sometimes deals with heinous acts of violence towards other individuals. This podcast may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to a special episode of California True Crime. I'm your host Sean for this evening, and tonight joining me is a very special guest. We have a journalist from the Calaveras Enterprise, Dakota Morlan. If you caught the Dateline about this case, you would have seen her on the show. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So in this episode, we are going to talk about the death of Christina Karlsen, what led up to the arrest of her husband, Karl Karlsen, and then get into his trial. So I'm first going to give you some background on the story. Then once we get to the trial, Dakota will pretty much take over from there since she was there every day. So Christina Karlsen grew up in Calaveras County and went to Bret Hart High School, which is in Angels Camp and is the only incorporated town in Calaveras County. In high school, she met her first husband. He served in the Air Force, and they got married and they moved to North Dakota. Here is where they both knew and met Karl Karlsen. Christina and her first husband divorced, and soon after, Karl and her got together. They left North Dakota and they moved to Seneca Falls, New York for a little bit. One thing they brought up a couple times in the Dateline is that this was the backdrop of where This Is a Wonderful Life was based, the movie with Jimmy Stewart, big Christmas movie. One thing they didn't mention is that this was also the place where the Seneca Falls Convention happened. This is where Elizabeth Stanton gave her speech about asking for the rights for women to vote. After some time, they moved back to Calaveras County. Karl and Christina had 3 children, Aaron, Levi, and Katie. And from the stories that I've gathered, the marriage was abusive, but Levi took the brunt of it. Now, a little bit about Calaveras County. It is an area roughly about an hour and a half east of Sacramento, and in the 2010 census, the population was 40,171. There you'll have the Calaveras Big Trees State Park with all the giant sequoias. There is also a lot of old history and considered part of the gold country. One of these places is Arnold, which is a cool little place, and I remember in 5th grade, I went to Arnold to go tobogganing. And this was the time when parachute pants were really popular. Dakota, do you remember parachute pants?
I know of MC Hammer. I don't know if that counts.
Those were, I think, from what I've seen watching the Can't Touch This video, like, over and over again, pretty sure those were, like, cloth. Mine were that material that would heat up if you would just walk. Like, they were just...
like...
And then
vinyl or whatever you would call
and it
that?
had like zippers all over. There was tons of pockets with zippers, but I was wearing those. I remember they got wet and I had to change my pants, and not knowing, I put them on a wood burning stove, which they started smoking, and I lost those pants that day, but that's just a memory that I have of Arnold. Also, you have the celebrated Jumping Frogs of Calaveras County, where they always have frog jumping contests. I've heard about them all my life, never went. Have you gone?
I have. I've actually jumped a frog or 2.
Oh, wow. That's exciting.
Yeah. It's a big deal. The frog jump is probably the biggest thing that happens in our county every year. And a lot of people like to come from out of town to try jumping a frog. But it's also just our fair, our every year fair. And in middle school and high school, I remember getting out of class like a couple days out of the week, that week. Especially for the ag students like me, which, like, if you grow up in Calaveras County, you're most likely going to be involved in ag.
Right.
So I was in 4-H, and we'd get out and get our pigs or cows or whatever we had ready. So the fair almost revolves as much around, like, agriculture as it would the frog jump.
Yeah. So you being from there, is there anything else you want to talk about in Calaveras County?
Another thing that's a little bit relevant, just in recent history, would be the issue we've been having with commercial cannabis. So some people have coined the term Cannabis County in the past, because I believe we're one of the first and only counties to legalize commercial marijuana back when it was first made legal statewide. And apparently we also have like this perfect environment for growing cannabis. I know people have been doing it illegally out there for years and years and years. So when that happened, our Board of Supervisors issued this urgency ordinance and made it legal for a short amount of time. And during that time, there was this, what they call the cannabis rush now, where all these growers came in trying to get in on the industry. And they bought up a lot of these properties that were affected by the Butte fire back in 2015 or 2016. They were, these cheap, big properties that you could grow commercial marijuana on. And so they got in just long enough to have their first crop and pay their taxes. And then the Board of Supervisors just, some new supervisors were elected. They pulled the rug out from under them. And then, long story short, Board of Supervisors got sued. It's been this back and forth. And just recently it got legalized again.
Do you think that had anything to do with like lawsuits pending or anything like that? Or
it's a really complicated issue. The people who are pro-commercial marijuana will tell you this has been going on for decades. People are going to grow anyway, so why don't we just regulate it? It's just such a huge county, but so low population. And it's just easy to hide marijuana out there if you're going to grow. It's not difficult at all. It's sort of ideal for that. So people are saying, hey, it's going to happen anyway, and the taxes from this will go towards enforcing, legal marijuana growing. So there's that, but a lot of people think it's also going to change the culture of the area.
Good or bad? They have their own opinion?
Yeah, mostly for the people who think it's going to change the culture mostly think for the bad.
Oh, okay.
But, during the short amount of time that it was legal, I remember there was a pot farm that moved in right across the street from us, and my only issue with it was that it was 20 acres or more was the law, and we live on a 20-acre parcel, which still feels very residential, and you could just smell it coming over in October. It was so strong. That's my only issue with it.
Yeah. So back to Christina. While living in Murphy's, which was another area in the county, Christina would teach her kids how to sew, make grilled cheese. They would go to the ice cream shop together. They would often take walks and collect leaves, which they would press into an album, which was big in the late 80s and 90s. I remember doing this at my grandma's house. We would watch Wonder Years and Unsolved Mysteries and then just press leaves into a thing. It was just that thing you did. On January 1st, 1991, while Christina was in the bathroom and the children were napping, a fire broke out in the house that they lived in. According to Karl, he broke in through the outside window of Levi's room and got him to safety. He then went back, broke through the window of the girls' room, and got both girls to safety. Karl said in an interview that the fire was so large by the time he tried to get Christina out, he wasn't able to get to her. From the descriptions of the pictures of how she was found, she was slumped over in the bathtub with a washcloth over her face. The only escape for Christina since the fire started in front of the bathroom door was the bathroom window, which was boarded up at some point. I guess after the window was broken, it was boarded up from the inside with some plywood and 17 nails. We're going to get really into that during the trial, so we'll leave that there for now. Ultimately, the case was closed as an accident in which Karl received $200,000 from the life insurance policy that he had opened 20 days before her death. Now, a week later, Karl gathered the children and moved to upstate New York, where his family lived. Now we're going to jump ahead to November 20th, 2008. On this day, Levi Carlson, son of Christina and Karl, he was working on a 1990 Chevy 2500 truck, which weighs 5,000 pounds. I watched the 2020 episode, and they kept calling it a pickup truck, which, people call things pickup trucks, but to me, this was like a truck. When I think of a pickup truck, I think of a small Nissan or a Mazda, and it's a smaller, barely hauls anything. But this was a big truck. The truck was propped up on a railroad jack, which is what it sounds like, a jack that hikes up a train car, and both wheels were taken off of the front of the truck. Levi was working underneath the truck when Karl and his new wife Cindy left for a funeral at noon. When they arrived home 4 hours later, they found Levi crushed under the truck. This was written off as a tragic accident, and Karl received over $700,000 from a life insurance policy that he had taken out on Levi only 17 days earlier. It wasn't until years later that the detectives in the case got a phone call telling them to follow the money. So they do, and they find both these insurance policies on Levi and Christina, plus they find one on a burned out car, which he received $10,000 for, and a barn fire where he lost some horses. For the barn fire, he received $115,000. So to add that all up through the years, he has received over $1 million in insurance money because of these accidents. So now that the investigators have this, they call Karl's present wife, Cindy, to see if she'll help them with Karl, and she agrees to. During this time, she kind of was putting everything together, and she got a little scared of him, and she had moved out already. She agreed to wear a wire and set up a dinner with Karl. She told him that they needed to talk and work on their marriage. She gets him to say that Levi's death was an opportunity. Then a week later, on November 12th, 2012, they're supposed to meet at some place again for dinner, but he is arrested there instead. Karl Karlsen would eventually plead guilty to second-degree murder for killing his son and said that he rigged the jack so it would fall. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. During this trial, nothing was allowed to be brought up about the fire that killed Christina. After this trial, Karl was formally charged with the murder of Christina. So now with all that, I'd like to take some time to get to know Dakota a little more before we get into the trial. So we know you grew up in Calaveras County. What got you on the path to be a journalist?
So I had a pretty kind of twisted path to becoming a journalist, I guess you could say, or non-traditional rather. So I moved back to Calaveras County after college, which was not the plan. Moved back in with my parents. I actually thought I would just be there temporarily because I was in the background check process for a job with the federal government. I majored in Arabic in college, so that was part of the reason why they were interested in me. And so I moved back home. I worked on a golf course as a, cart girl, like bev cart girl, and did that for about a year. And I was going crazy with boredom, just like my mind's not meant for that type of environment. Like I was alone most of the time, just like thinking about stuff and just it wasn't ideal. So I was like, well, I need a job like right now that I just can do that, I just need a job now. So I heard that the local paper might be hiring, and I just decided, I've always loved writing. I've always had a passion for that medium. And so I just called up the paper and I was like, hey, I heard you might need someone. And like something like the next day I had like a quote unquote interview, but it was just having like lunch with the publisher. And he just talked to me for a while and said, all right, well, you want to start Monday? And I was like, okay. So I came in and just really learned on the job. I learned everything I know on the job. I, had never taken a journalism class. I was just Googling AP style all the time. And really, sink or swim. So, and then right after I got there, the two other reporters who were working with me, within probably like 2 months of me getting there, they both quit. So I was the only reporter. I was the senior reporter within 2 months of working there. And so I think that's kind of how I got into covering courts and crime, because as a reporter, like what's going on in your local court system is pretty much the main thing that you would be covering, plus car accidents and that kind of thing. So, so then they hired a couple more people. Davis, I know you know Davis.
Right, Davis.
So they hired a couple more and things got a little bit more relaxed, and I stuck with courts and crime as my main beat because that's just sort of I got into.
You enjoy it though.
do. I like.
I mean, as much as you can.
I've always been
enjoy
into
that.
true crime,
Mm-hmm.
just in my, general interests. I'm really into psychology. I love listening to podcasts about psychology and true crime. So I guess looking back, it was sort of a natural progression, but I didn't see it that way at the time. It was just sort of this is where I ended up. Yeah, I just like how everything has a reason behind it in the courtroom. So people kind of, even though there's kind of an unspoken knowledge of what's going on. Like when a prosecutor does something, they have to explain to the whole court why they're doing it. And I'm not going to say it's easier, but besides just like the human intrigue and the drama of it and that sort of thing, like I like that if you're sitting in that courtroom, like you're going to get the story of what's going on because it's all there in front of you.
Right.
As opposed to more investigative, knocking on doors, hustling. I'm more of an introvert, so that makes me a little bit uncomfortable to have to go. Yeah, I wouldn't say proposition people, but like actually go like chase people down and knock on doors and get in there. Like I don't like that.
That
like
sounds so scary to me.
At least if you're in the courtroom, you know that everyone's knows why they're there, and if you have to go interview a family member, it's just a lot easier than going and chasing someone down.
Right.
It's kind of the part of journalism I don't enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, even the part of having to interview family members and stuff would still be scary to me.
Yeah, that was something I really wrestled with in the beginning, and I still do all the time, is how do you approach that? So I will usually, if I do have to interview a family member who just lost a loved one, I will maybe reach out to someone who knows them on Facebook. I'll find someone who's not directly related, and I'll say, hey, I know this is a really horrible time for you, but I'm writing this story, and if you'd like to have a voice in it, please let this person know that they can contact me. And so I try not to, I don't know if that's the way that you're supposed to do it as a journalist. It's just the way that I kind of figured out that I feel okay with.
You're letting them make the decision instead of just jumping in their face.
Exactly. And I've had, it's the Calaveras Enterprise, so we don't have a ton of competition. We're not all kind of like running to the scene and trying to get the best quote. Yeah. It's sort of just for me it's worked out well because I've had some pretty meaningful stories written that way about some pretty rough stuff, and I feel like I've gotten to best represent what the family wanted to say in a way where they felt comfortable and there was more of a connection between us because they reached out to me.
Right.
But yeah, that's a really tough thing to handle for me, especially as an introvert, is just reaching out to people and just calling them out of the blue.
Yeah. So with this case, how did you end up getting involved? Obviously, you're with the paper, but what was like the starting point with that?
So like I said before, when I came in pretty soon after I got there, I was suddenly the only reporter and the senior reporter. And so you just sort of, when you come into a position like that, you sort of like inherit the stories from years past. Mm-hmm. So I was told by the publisher, who was serving as editor as well at the time, that there's just sort of this list of cases that were ongoing that I should keep an eye on. And so I did. I tried to look at past coverage of it, and especially just from our paper, and sort of pick up where we left off. And you keep track on my main source is the court website, so the Calaveras County Superior Court website, where you can just search people's names and you can see when their next court date's going to be. And then once you actually get in there and you start going to court dates, everything sort of just falls into place. So like you are the main person who's there a lot of the time. Sometimes there's not even family members there, and your reporting is letting people know what's going on in that courtroom. And a lot of times you just have to be there because there's information and like scheduling that goes on that you might not get wind of if you're not actually physically going to the courthouse. So yeah, this was just one of those cases that I inherited, I guess you could say.
Okay, so you have these cases that you're watching, and then with this one, you actually had some contact with Karl Karlsen before the trial and everything, correct? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was about a year before the trial. Let's see. Yeah, just about. So I guess I'll go back to, I got contacted by Dateline back probably around fall of 2018 because his attorney had quit the day before his trial was set to begin in October.
Was there a reason why?
So we weren't allowed to hear that reason why.
Okay.
We were actually excused from the courtroom when he gave his reason, but it was a conflict of interest.
Okay.
Is what it was officially called. And so he quit, and then he was without an attorney for quite some time. And looking back, you know, it makes sense now that that's probably why they contacted me during that time, was that they wanted to try to get an interview with him while he didn't have an attorney.
Oh, okay.
Because usually Carl's more than willing to give interviews. It's just his attorney is telling him not to.
Yeah.
So they contacted me and they said, you know, this is what we're trying to do. We're having some trouble with the jail. They're not getting back to us. Could you help us? And so I tried to facilitate that a little bit. And after that, you know, knowing that they were having trouble getting an interview with him, I was thinking, you know, I know that he reads the Calaveras Enterprise in jail. They give him to all the inmates there. So why don't I try to just talk to him and see what happens? And at this point, I really did not know much about the case other than just what I read about it. I didn't really watch anything or listen to anything about it. I was kind of waiting till a little bit before the trial got started to really take a deep dive into it. But I really, honestly, had been putting that off because I had other cases I was following, and I just was going to put that off till the time came. So I went in with sort of a clean slate. When I reached out to him, I sent him a letter. I kept it pretty short and simple. I just said, you know, hey, if you can have a tone of voice in a letter. Right. I just kept it casual. It's like, hey, you know, I write for the Calaveras Enterprise. I would be interested in doing an interview with you if you want to discuss that. And he got back to me pretty quick. And he said he was very eager to do an interview. He wanted people to hear his side of the story, as long as I promised that I could be fair. He's like, can you do that? And he always puts little smiley faces at the end of his letters. And I said, yeah, of course I can be fair. You know, that's hopefully if I'm doing my job right, I always try to be fair and hear him out. So I think I also hoped at that time, and this turned out to be true, that he knew that I hadn't been in journalism for that long. I mean, he was extradited to Calaveras County in 2016. I started in February of 2018. And I think he knew that I was kind of young and maybe could be swayed one way or another. And right. I was expecting that he would try to take advantage of that to some degree. So I went down there. It was around during the holidays. So it was like December of 2018. And we met up in an attorney meeting room. So there was glass between us, but you can pass papers underneath, and we're pretty much alone in there. It's not like you're on the phone or anything like that.
So you had multiple meetings, or you conversed back and forth by letter a lot? And
yeah, lots of letters. Our first meeting, when I went in there, let's see. So it was about 2 hours long.
Oh, okay.
And the person at the jail actually had to get on the intercom and tell me it was time to go because he was talking my ear off.
Yeah. So
when I first went in with what I knew about the case, and I just knew what he looked like, I was actually really taken aback by... So you've heard him talk. He has this very high-pitched voice.
Yeah, it was. I was watching that show, and I just, it didn't fit. I mean, everyone's voices are different and everything like that, but from all the pictures, because at first, like, if you watch shows, they just show pictures and pictures and pictures.
Yeah.
And then, it didn't fit the body, I felt like.
Yeah, the only way I can describe it is just surreal. I think meeting any person that you've read about in the news and seen pictures of or seen on TV, you have a certain expectation. And whatever that was, it just wasn't what I got.
Right.
It never is going to be exactly what you get when you meet someone in person. And, you know, he's not very tall. He seemed very amiable. He was very talkative. But of course, always talking about himself and keeping the focus on his innocence and that sort of thing, which makes sense. I'll give that to him. Like, if I were wrongfully accused, you know, that would be all I would talk about. Right. But he also would go off on tangents about, you know, his duck farm business and his giant horses. And that's the thing with Karl. And you'll see this. He's pretty consistent in every interrogation that he has as far as like how he comes across. not that I was interrogating him, I think I was just sitting there listening and I couldn't really come up for air. I was just trying to maintain eye contact and just, try to keep up with what he was saying. So, yeah, he has this thing where everything with him, it's like the biggest, the best, so he raised these Belgian draft horses, and he'll talk about this during his interrogation that they showed during the trial. But when I was watching that during the trial, I'm like, I've heard all of this before because I talked to him. He's always talking about the same stuff. He's complaining about his injuries all the time. He had back surgery at one point. He's always complaining about, like, in way too much detail, his operations that he had and his complications that he had with that. But yeah, we kind of talked about horses a little bit because I grew up with horses, and he's like, oh, so you know horses then? He's like, well, I used to have, the biggest Belgian draft horse mare in the whole country. And oddly enough, she died in a fire, but we'll get to that later. So he's just always talking about himself and how great he is. And he also really likes to talk about how unlucky he's been. Mm-hmm. That's sort of his main spiel is, how can someone be as unlucky as I am? And actually during the second meeting when he gave me this big stack of, his handwritten life story and notes and documents from his previous conviction, one of the things that he included was this long timeline list of all the horrible things that's happened to him in the past.
He documented it all?
Everything.
Wow.
Losing family members to cancer, his own murders that he was convicted of, which he doesn't see it that way, his back surgeries, his injuries, all of that. So he has this very kind of woe is me dialogue that goes on, or monologue rather, that you can see in all of his interrogations or conversations. So yeah, I was when I first went in for that first 2-hour meeting, I was sort of taken aback by how amiable he seemed and pretty smart overall, conversational. And it was funny. It wasn't until I got out that I really got to even think about what he had said. And I thought, did he kill his wife is what I was thinking. Did he do it? And the only thing I could think was, I don't know if he killed his wife because I don't have the information yet, but he does seem like the type of person who could kill his wife. I just wouldn't be that surprised. Mm-hmm. And you find that weird that I would say that, saying that he was an amiable, talkative person. But there were times during that conversation that when I walked away from it, I looked back at it and I was like, well, that's not how you would talk about a loved one. He was describing his wife to me, Christina, and what a good wife she was. And the way that he described her, it was talking about how good at cooking she was and good at sewing, and why would you ever want to get rid of someone like that? But it seemed fine, but he never said anything about who she was as a person. It was just what services she provided to him.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how he talks about everything in his life. The only time he mustered a little bit of, I don't know if they were real tears, but he seemed to get emotional, was when he was talking about how his kids grew up without a mother because he wasn't able to save her, and having to tell his in-laws that he wasn't able to save their baby. Yeah, talking about that, he seemed to get a little bit emotional, but I didn't feel anything inside when I saw him do that. Because then he just switches back. And I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I was like, he's been in jail for a while now. He's had almost 30 years to think about this case and to get over it, and I could see why you'd sort of be numb to the whole thing at this point.
Yeah, and also have a dialogue that might change back and forth because he's thought about the same things over and over again. So for talking to one thing and then changing a demeanor that just seems odd to you, it could just be because it's been in his head so long that it's almost like a script in his head.
Exactly, like a script.
Yeah.
And even if it is true, even if he did not kill his wife or his son, as he would like you to believe, I could see how having to defend your innocence over and over again, you would create that script, and it would just become that to some degree.
Right.
So either way, no matter for what reason that it has become that script, he is on this sort of the KK loop. That's what I like to, you get sucked into the vortex of KK, and
because he's probably talked about it a lot to everyone in the jail. He's probably said the same things over and over again.
He has. And those little inconsistencies that he's given people that helped get him convicted, I think, most of those inconsistencies happened at the very, very beginning. So what he told people in the hours after the fire, what happened. When you start to see his story change is in the subsequent interrogations that he had. And with that, he's been, for the most part, consistent. So even since, 30 years ago, his first interview with police, I would say his whole story of what happened has been fairly consistent.
Yeah. Okay, with all that going into the trial, why don't we talk about jury selection since you were there for that?
So the funny things about, I haven't sat on too many or listened to too many trials, but you always feel like, oh, wow, this is actually happening. I can't believe it's happening after it gets postponed so many times. And then the first day that they list as the trial day is just the first day of jury selection, which can take a long time,
right,
depending on the case. So jury selection for this trial took 2.5 days. And in the end, they selected 7 women and 5 men. And 2 men and 2 women were chosen as alternate jurors. So it was kind of interesting. I didn't sit in on the whole thing, but I did listen to a good portion of it. And obviously something that kept coming up was, have you heard anything about this case via media, whatever else, word of mouth? And it was really hard for both sides to find anyone who hadn't heard about the case.
Kind of a small community.
It is. It's a small community. So if you've been living under a rock, maybe you didn't hear about it from your neighbor when it happened. And of course, Calaveras County has a lot of older people in it. Like our general demographic, if you had to really sum it up, would be, older white people who are retired. So a lot of them were also a lot of old families too. So a lot of them were around at the time that this case happened, almost 30 years ago. And if they went to Bret Hart High School, like I did, they might have known Christina Karlsen,
right,
had opinions about it. And then on top of that, you see it on TV. It ran on Dateline on 2020. It's really hard not to be exposed to it. And then that's not counting us, like the Calaveras Enterprise. We put it on the front page of the paper. So that was interesting. They were trying to find people who didn't know anything about the case. And in the end, at least several of the jurors did know about the case. They didn't know anything. They said they didn't know any details, but they had kind of heard of it in passing, or it was kind of cute because they were trying to be as clear as possible and as honest as possible. And they'd say, oh, well, there was this one time where I was building a fire and I lifted up the paper and I saw a picture of, it looks like Karl Karlsen, because he's present during a lot of this. And I didn't think much of it, and I threw it into the fire. And it's like, so they're saying like every single little tiny thing they might have heard about this case.
So they really wanted, those jurors seemed like they wanted to do their part, be a good juror during
For the most part, yeah. It was interesting watching them knowing what the case was going to be, because they didn't know a lot of the time unless they'd heard of the case beforehand. Sometimes you'd go talk to people, like I talk to people just in my daily life, and they said that they got called for jury duty. Like, actually, my dad got called for jury duty that same week, and it happened to be a different case.
Oh, okay.
But sometimes if you got called, you'd be like, oh, I have jury duty. And the person would say, oh, is that for the Carlson case? Yeah. So it's like really hard not to hear about it.
Right.
So, yeah. So who they actually ended up seating in the jury, some of them did know about the case, but it was very minor details that they knew. And they said that, I saw it on the media. I won't let that affect my judgment. I know that the media doesn't always print the truth. And of course, both the prosecution and the defense have to agree on every single juror. Right. So I feel like they vetted it to some degree. One interesting thing that one potential juror said, who ended up not being selected, I don't know how old he was. He was probably in his 20s, maybe about like my age. And he said, he basically just said, I don't feel like I am qualified to sit on a case that happened before I was born. Huh. And he was very adamant about that. He's like, I don't want to pass a judgment on something that happened before I was born. And I don't know if that's why they dismissed him. Obviously, they have to fill out their jury questionnaires, and they can dismiss people based off of those answers. But he ended up being dismissed. Other things that they were concerned about was just the weather. So it was in January when the trial started. A lot of people live what they call upcountry, up in the mountains, and if it snowed, which it was supposed to, it would have affected their commute to get down the hill.
Oh,
People
okay.
get snowed in a lot. And surprisingly, the whole trial, even the judge said this, he was very surprised that none of the alternate jurors were ever used. So even though there was, one individual who was complaining about health problems throughout it, like sometimes she had to ask to have it adjourned early, we worked around that. No one quit. So everyone stayed through the whole 13-day long trial. Yeah, I think I wrote here in my article about it that the jury consisted of locals from a range of ages, both working and retired, some new to the county and some longtime natives. I feel like, considering how the demographics of Calaveras County as a whole are, they managed to get for the most part, a good age range in there. The racial demographic was not diverse at all. It was pretty much all white, as far as I can remember. But that's, pretty typical for a Calaveras County jury.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how race would have played into
Right,
this. So.
yeah. All right, so now that we have the jury, the trial actually starts on January 14th of this year, 2020. So we'll get right into this with Dakota telling us.
Yeah. So I'd kind of like to start out with the first article covering the trial that I wrote. I just think that it really... So what they did was the prosecution, their first witness that they brought up was Erin DeRoche, who is Karl Karlsen's oldest daughter. And I just think it was the best way to start it out. It started strong. She gave sort of the background of what happened that day. Mind you, she was just shy of 7 years old when this happened. So I think the jury definitely had in mind that her memory could be a little bit hazy. And I do have some opinions about that if we want to talk about it after. But when she came up, you could just tell that she was ready for this. She had been waiting. She's this, very pretty girl in her 30s. I think she has long red hair, kind of fiery red hair, and this sort of very strong personality. And she also, fun fact, she told me she works for the federal government as a Farsi translator, and I think she knows a couple other Middle Eastern languages as well. Oh. So we bonded over that a little bit. I was like, how did you do it? How did you get your job?
Yeah.
But it wasn't really the time to talk about that. Anyway, I was just really impressed by her and her composure. And yeah, I'd like to read this first article, or the majority of the article, because I think it's just a good way to start this. So, all right. So this is on January 14th, 2020. Quote, "After 30 years, that's about all I can say," unquote. Arlene Meltzer attempted to articulate the long, tragic road that led her to a Calaveras County courtroom, from her daughter's death in a 1991 house fire to her grandson's gruesome murder in 2008, to this morning, a beginning of an end, with just minutes until her former son-in-law, Karl Karlsen, would be tried for her daughter's alleged murder. "But I've been strong," she said. "God's been with me." Supported by loved ones, Meltzer heard the testimonies of her granddaughter and 5 first responders through sound-amplifying headphones, occasionally dabbing her eyes and murmuring words of affirmation. The defendant's eldest daughter, Erin DeRoche, flew in from out of state to be the first to testify against her father. DeRoche was just shy of 7 years old when Carlson pulled her and her 2 younger siblings out of the house fire on Pennsylvania Gulch Road. Her mother, reportedly trapped in the bathroom by a boarded-up window, did not escape the inferno. "Some details are funny," she said, "but there are some things you don't forget." DeRoche vividly recounted the everyday realities of life in the Carlson household. She described an otherwise idyllic childhood in Murphy's when her mother, Christina Carlson, was alive. The family frequented the ice cream shop on Main Street, she said, and her mother taught her how to sew and make grilled cheese. The 30-year-old mother often took her children on walks through their rural communities to collect leaves, which they would press into albums. But her father, DeRoche said, was a more tense presence in her life. "We were walking on eggshells," she said. "My father's mood predicated how the day would go." On one occasion, DeRoche recalled Carlson kicking a plastic egg carton through the front door, leaving a hole. However, her father's primary target was her younger brother, Levi, she said. "He broke a multi-inch cutting board over Levi's backside. My father basically abused my brother on multiple occasions," DeRoche said, recalling beatings with pipes, shovels, pitchforks, and cattle prods. "If there was an item close by, it was used." The abuse continued for years, she said, after her father relocated the family to his native New York shortly after Christina Karlsen's death, and until Levi ultimately left home. When asked why she didn't report the abuse, she said that Karl Karlsen threatened to kill his children if they did. He said that, should we try to report it, call the police and call an ambulance, because we would be dead by the time they got there, she said. Also seared into DeRoche's memory is that fateful New Year's Day in 1991. But it was only after years of growing up, she said, that she began to realize the significance of some of the details she witnessed that day. The first memory she recounted was her father taking her and her siblings outside to burn the Christmas tree. He wanted us to see how quickly a house could go, DeRoche said. He doused the tree in flammable liquid and lit a match. It was gone in a few moments. After that, the children took a nap, she said, as their mother was planning to go shopping later on. She recalled a kerosene spill on their carpet outside of the bathroom about 2 days prior. I just remember waking up, DeRoche testified, though she couldn't remember what woke her. It was hot, and she saw flames through the ajar bedroom door. I heard my mother screaming, "Karl, get the kids," she said. DeRoche said she woke up her sister, who shared her room, and tried in vain to push a dresser away from the window it was blocking. She said she didn't know how the dresser came to be in front of the window, as it usually remained in the girl's closet. As the room grew smoky, DeRoche said her father broke through the window from outside and moved the dresser before pulling both girls to safety. She said Carlson then took them to the truck a few hundred feet away from the home, where the family's Dalmatian was already waiting. Shortly after, he left and reappeared with Levi. He told the kids to stay down in the truck, but I was 6 and curious, DeRoche said. She testified that she witnessed her father repeatedly kick the concrete at the base of the house below the small bathroom window, which was higher up. He was giving it a few good kicks, DeRoche said. It didn't really seem logical if he was actually trying to get her out. DeRoche said she didn't remember seeing any board on the window at that time. As far as I know, the window was perfectly operational, she said. After kicking at the concrete, DeRoche said her father came back to stand beside the truck. He wasn't emotional, but he also kind of seemed to be out of it. He didn't seem to be moving with any expediency, she said. It was her own suggestion to call for help, DeRoche said. The remaining members of the family piled into the truck and passed by the nearest home, with Carlson at the wheel opting to drive further down the street to another neighbor's house, where a 911 call was placed. Shortly after, the family returned to the driveway of the burning house where first responders were beginning to arrive. The house was almost entirely engulfed in flames, and my mother wasn't screaming, DeRoche said. She recalled her father telling her Mommy had gone to heaven just before the family filed into an ambulance to be checked by emergency medical personnel. Inside the ambulance, Carlson laid on a gurney with a gash on his forehead, DeRoche remembered. He might have been crying, she said. In the days following the fire, DeRoche recalled staying at a family friend's home and being awoken by her father to talk with an investigator. Her uncle flew out to help the family move to New York, where they would be closer to Carlson's family, she said. As the years passed, DeRoche said she began to question the events surrounding her mother's death. She confided only in her brother Levi. We knew our father had murdered our mother, DeRoche said. The family's secrets came to a head when Levi confronted Carlson in front of her and their stepmother. DeRoche said her father asked his children what the community would think if they knew they had accused him. He was concerned about his image, said DeRoche, who remembered the altercation ending in a fistfight between Carlson and his son. Sometime later in 2012, DeRoche said she went to visit her father in the Seneca County Jail prior to his conviction in Levi's 2008 murder, in which he admitted to kicking the jacks from beneath a truck his son was working on, crushing him to death. I visited him hoping he would tell me something to help me understand what he'd done, DeRoche said. I was looking for some closure. Instead, she said, Carlson insulted her deceased brother and boasted of his superiority in jail. I told him I knew that he had killed my brother and my mother, DeRoche said. He grinned like a Cheshire cat and told me, it's been 20 years and they haven't got me yet. They're not going to. DeRoche said that she reported the conversation to the lead investigator in Levi's case. That report with the Seneca County Sheriff's Office was presented as evidence by the prosecution. It did not detail Carlson's alleged grin, but stated he was arrogant and boastful. When asked by public defender Richard Esquivel why she had not also reported the incident to law enforcement in Calaveras County, DeRoche responded that there was no investigation regarding her mother's death at the time. DeRoche remained articulate under a battery of questions from the defense, breaking into tears only when shown a picture of her deceased mother. When asked about her feelings toward her father, she replied, "I think that's pretty hard to describe. Ultimately, he is my father. We don't have a relationship. It's complicated." Later, she added, "I'm pretty impartial towards him as a whole. I don't hate him. Based on what I know of the evidence in this case, I think that there is enough to prove that he has done this." Esquivel asked DeRoche why, at one point, she wrote a letter thanking her father for saving her from the fire. "I am grateful he saved me," she said. "He had an option that day."
So that's a lot, and that's all just from the first day, which is pretty crazy. But let's try to break down some of this. When I was listening, I found the interesting about the kerosene, which we haven't really touched on yet, but this was supposedly the big thing that caused the fire. And so there's a little backstory of all the kerosene and stuff like that. So what were they saying about that?
So in the interrogation in New York that we got to see from 2012, and in other phone conversations that we listened to with investigators and stuff like that, Carlson himself, he's changed his story kind of on when the kerosene spill happened. You know, you could attribute that just to time, but it was kind of a matter of weeks before, a matter of days before. We didn't really know. But one thing that wasn't questioned was that there was a spill of kerosene in the hallway outside the bathroom door that happened no less than a day before the fire occurred.
Okay.
So that's a given. That's something everyone can agree on, was that it was no less than 24 hours before there was a kerosene spill in that hallway. So really the only person who had any professional opinion on what happened with the kerosene spill was contracted by State Farm. And I gotta say, from sitting through this trial, listening to kind of the really thorough investigation that State Farm did in this, if I got murdered, I'd kind of like to have State Farm investigate.
They're pretty good at it.
They were very impressive. Ultimately, though, as we know, even though these investigators recommended that State Farm not pay out the claim, they did end up paying $215,000 to Carlson in January of 1992, so about a year later. Mm-hmm. We never got to hear exactly why that decision was made because the prosecution shut it down. I think it was too much hearsay. But I would speculate that, it's $215,000. Calaveras County had declared it an accident at that point. There's no charges being filed. I think that the potential lawsuit that they could get out of that wouldn't make it worth it to not pay him.
So it was a kerosene spill that was supposedly by the dog and cat.
Yeah. So we'll go back to that. So what Karl tells us is that he didn't see it happen, but he thinks that the dog and the cat were fighting and the dog knocked over the kerosene. And his story was that the pipes had frozen. It was cold that winter and the pipes had frozen. And so they were bringing in water in whatever they could get their hands on to flush the toilet, take a bath, do the dishes. And this was something the prosecution tried to kind of flesh out, was what kind of jugs were they using to bring in water? Was it possible to confuse water with kerosene? They were also using kerosene to heat the house through old-fashioned kerosene heaters, mm-hmm. which I've never seen before. It sounds really dangerous, but
yeah, probably.
Yeah. But that's the thing with Karl too, is whenever he described what the house was like, there were fire hazards everywhere. There was a wood stove, there were kerosene heaters, there were open candles, and but his story was that we don't know exactly when it happened, but this kerosene spilled, and of course it was Christina who'd mistaken the water for kerosene and brought in the jug, and then the dog knocked it over, and then he said, and he specifically said this, that they use clothes to mop up the kerosene. One of those articles of clothing was the sweater that Christina had knitted Karl for Christmas, and they just used the clothes to mop it up. Mm-hmm. And then Christina, of course, put that in the dryer. And then on New Year's Day, the day that it happened, the dryer was venting into the house, he said, and it filled the house with this kerosene vapor, like this smoke. So he had to go open all the windows and clear the smoke out. He also said that they put down boxes, like cardboard, on top of the kerosene spill so the kids could walk on top of it.
Okay.
And we do have, to corroborate this, we do have a family friend who visited the house on, December 30th, if I could check my timeline right here. Yeah, I think it was December 30th. She visited the house that evening, and her name was Gail Hardy, and she testified that at that time she smelled kerosene and the window was boarded up. But then the prosecution also put Dennis Hertz on the stand, and he was one of the family members of the people who own the house that they're renting from. And he'd visited earlier that day to possibly move into the house, which is another indicator here that maybe they thought they'd be having to move soon. He came to visit the house, and he didn't see any board on the window at that time.
Oh, okay.
So the prosecution took this as their way of showing when all that happened. And according to them, the kerosene spill and the window, both of those things happened on December 30th at some time.
Okay, so a day before.
Well, yeah, 2 days, because December 31st, and then,
Sorry.
Yeah, no, there's a 31st in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then if you talk to Karl, depending on when you hear what he says, he'll say it happened, weeks before. He doesn't really remember. So that's the first kerosene spill that happened. And then about a month after the fire, State Farm employed Ken Buskey, and he's a forensic engineer, and according to him, he's worked on determining like sources for other fires, like high profile fires. Like I think he worked on like the Rim Fire in Yosemite. Like he's pretty well respected, is what you need to know. So he came out, and mind you, this was like a month after the fire. So at this point, there'd been a lot of activity going on there. The house had been overhauled by the fire department, which means, I think that just means like they go in and like they dig out the debris and they try to get it to a point where it's like manageable for the property owner. So he's not coming onto a pristine scene here. And that's like what the defense latched onto as their main argument, was they just totally targeted Ken Buskey. He was the only witness besides their own expert witness that they called, was just Ken.
Mm-hmm.
Because they thought if they destroyed his testimony, there would be no like actual physical proof that any of this ever happened. And the reason why they targeted him so much is because when he went there and looked at the scene, he determined through his own testing and through just looking at what was there, that there was a second kerosene pour.
Okay.
And when you say pour, you mean like intentional pour. It was horseshoe shaped, he said. So if you're looking at the hallway, the exit of the hallway was like the open part of the horseshoe, and one side was right in front of the bathroom, and then the top of it blocked the kids' rooms they were sleeping in their rooms at the time, and then the other only exit through the laundry room, because the laundry room was right across from the bathroom. And he even drew a diagram of that for State Farm, and they showed that. And he said that the second pour happened just moments before the fire.
Okay.
And he determined that, he goes into how he determined it through like wicking and how kerosene wicks through the carpet that they had. So yeah, that was some of the most damning physical evidence that we got to see during the trial. And the way that it looked to me, the way that it was oriented, I was like, oh, that just looks like he went up, did a straight pour around the front of his body, and then he lit it, and then left an open part in the back so he could back out and go out the front of the house.
And how did he and how did others say that the fire started?
So he determined that it had to have been started by application of open flame, which means either a match, something that would have been destroyed in the fire.
Okay.
What Karl kind of tried to point to in interviews with investigators was that he'd been working up in the attic right before it started, and he had a trouble light with him.
What's a trouble light? I read that. I don't know.
I know
what that
trouble light gets brought up a lot. I learned a lot about trouble lights during this case. So a trouble light, it's just that like a bulb that you can hook onto something if
Okay.
you're like working on a car or something has a metal cage around it.
That's what I thought it was, but I'd never heard the term. So.
Yeah. So Carl's whole thing that, when investigators were first talking to him on the phone, after we get to listen to this recording after he goes back to New York, is that he keeps kind of pointing people in the direction of the trouble light. Like, oh, I might have left it on the ground. I don't remember when I went out to the garage to get something, because that's when the fire started. And the investigator kind of nudges him towards that, and he's like, oh my god, like that's what happened. I left the, oh boy, I left the trouble light, and so he never says that's how it started, but that's always kind of like his suggestion. But then he also suggests other things too, like there was an open candle right next to it. He said that maybe a kid knocked over, like I said, his whole thing is he points to as many different fire hazards as possible that it could have been. So also another weird thing at this time was, some will tell you that it looked like it was just a booby trap of like keeping Christina in the bathroom, because there were cardboard boxes stacked up in the hallway, as well as cardboard over the spill. And he would tell you, we were moving the winter clothes down from the attic, so there was like 30 boxes stacked up in the hallway, that sort of thing. But just a lot of stuff like that. Another thing too is one fire investigator, when he first got there, noticed that the fire detectors had been, well, one of them in the hallway, the battery was taken out and lying on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more details there where they determined like the battery had to be on the floor before the fire started. And then there were some other fire detectors that some said were also taken out, and that looked a little fishy.
I think it's interesting how it goes. The details leading up to everything were like his book of unfortunate events in a way, where it's pipes are frozen, bringing in kerosene, the dog knocks it over. It's just all these little things that just keep going. The window breaks, vapor in the house. There's all of these so detailed into it. It's pretty interesting.
The other thing too is it's usually Christina's fault. So he told people that Christina broke the window when she was trying to open it. She's the one who mistook the kerosene for water.
Yeah, I read that about the plunger. Supposedly she was trying to open it with a plunger.
And there's also, the prosecution even tried to discredit the whole pipes freezing thing, because they brought up the owners of the house who'd lived there for years, and they said, we told them if you just run the water through the faucet, you let it trickle, the pipes will never freeze, and that kind of thing.
I find it interesting. We talked about this a little, me and you, beforehand, and if you've seen videos of this, like of the house burnt, the family members took that, and that was cousins of Christina. And who was that again?
So this is an interesting part of the trial. If you know anything about this case, I know it was pretty highly publicized. It's before my time, so I'd actually never heard of this case until I brought home some of the writings that Karl had written up for me about the case, and he was saying like that, for not to cuss, but that gosh darn Ellie Nessler and Jan Starr, and just saying, how he didn't care for them and how they contaminated the crime scene. It's like, what is this? What does this mean? And I was living with my parents at the time, and they looked at it. My mom's like, Ellie Nessler? She's like, Ellie Nessler? I'm like, who's Ellie Nessler? So then I did a Google search, and she is best known for shooting to death her son's alleged molester in court back in Jamestown in Tuolumne County in 1993. And her whole case garnered a ton of media attention, and this, I would say probably the majority of people, just average people, supported her and kind of hailed her as a hero. And her sister, Jan Starr, was actually in the courtroom at the time and allegedly, jumped on top of her to protect her from being shot by the security guards after that happened, or the bailiffs. So it turns out that Ellie Nessler and Jan Starr are cousins of Christina Carlson. And Ellie Nessler is now passed, but Jan Starr actually testified during the trial. And she said that she had visited Chris a couple times before her death. And the most recent time she visited, She observed a scene where, long story short, Karl chased Levi into the room, and he was just this very kind of scary presence, and Chris looked upset and scared and told her, like, I'm not supposed to have company, you should leave. And she also tried to mention that she saw her have a black eye one time, but the she wouldn't, it was too much hearsay, so the defense didn't want her to talk about that. So after this happened, she and Ellie Nessler were very suspicious, like a lot of the family members, I'm assuming, were. And she went to the scene, and they took some video footage. They say, like, just about the day after, a couple days after, of the burned house. And they go through, and they showed this footage during the trial. I think it's Ellie who's holding the camera, and Jan Starr, you can be seen kind of like looking through stuff. And she goes and, like, we look at the board that's on the window, and she kind of pulls the board away, and you can see that it's somewhat loose. Like, it doesn't look like it's nailed into the drywall on the inside. So we go around, we look at the crime scene, and then it cuts, and then it goes to the same crime scene again, but there's a lot of stuff that's different about it. So they're there with some different people. It's a different day. She testified she thought it was no more than like 24 hours after, but that's really not possible. Like, it was determined that it had to have been weeks after.
Just because of how things were around.
Yeah, the bathtub was cleaned out from debris. The whole thing was kind of overhauled. And anyway, so this footage that we have of the scene is really the only photographic evidence we have left, because everything else was destroyed. State Farm, and I don't even know if the sheriff's office had anything, but Cal Fire at the time, like, they all had like 7-year records.
Well, and it's understandable because at the time it was considered an accident. It's not like
it wasn't an ongoing case,
right.
So they destroyed all that stuff after 7 years. So except for one investigator, the fire investigator with Cal Fire, Carl Kent, he went and actually saved some documents.
Oh, okay.
Even though he wasn't technically supposed to, he said he felt like he would have to testify someday. So he was a key witness too. But yeah, this video footage is the only actual, like, photographic evidence we have left of the crime scene. So the defense showed, actually, I don't remember if it was the prosecution who showed him it too, but Ken Buskey, the investigator for State Farm, was shown that footage during his testimony. And that's when some of the issues with the timeline came up, where he's like, well, that's not, that second half, that's not what this, like, the scene looked like that when I got there. It didn't look like that. And basically the defense lashed onto that and said, oh, when you came, it was a contaminated crime scene. It had been overhauled. How can you make any judgment on how this fire was started? And he just kind of stood firm and didn't back down. And he said, I go to a lot of scenes that are contaminated. It doesn't affect my opinion at all. But yeah, that footage and Ken Buskey's testimony were what the defense latched onto the most.
So a big part of this case was the insurance policies. So if you want to go into that a little bit, we know of the 4, but that was brought up a lot.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. So what the prosecution was doing here with almost 50 or so witnesses, there was a long parade of witnesses here, and most of them were just character witnesses a lot of the time. I like to say it was sort of a trial of personality, so they were trying to show who Karl Karlsen is, what his pattern is, and how this fits with his pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they did a pretty good job of that. Should I talk a little bit about his first fire incident in the military? I don't know. This might be a good time to talk about it. Yeah. I don't know. So I'll go in. I don't think that he actually started this fire, so I won't talk about it for too long, but it is kind of a crazy story. So when he was working for the Air Force, he used to be the truck driver for transporting nuclear warheads.
Wow, that's crazy.
Just terrifying.
Yeah.
In retrospect. But so that was his job. And at one point when he was driving this warhead through Grand Forks, the trailer caught on fire for whatever reason. And his big thing that he liked to say is that you never stop with a nuclear warhead. That was our number one that was our number one order, was that we never stop. But he said in this case, he went against orders. He had to stop and put out the fire because it could have been a national crisis. And the prosecution didn't get to admit this during the trial, but they wanted, I think it might have been admitted just for the jury to look at, but they had the government's write-up of how he behaved during that whole thing, and they basically commended him for being quick to action and taking care of the situation. So that was kind of interesting. That's the first fire that I know of that he was involved in. So then after he meets Christina while he's still in the Air Force, her childhood sweetheart who she married was also serving in the Air Force, and he introduced them. He testified that he had like an injury and he, like his foot was hurt or something. And so he introduced Chris to Karl at an officers club one time and had them dance together, and they danced and had a wonderful night. And we don't get much more detail than that other than he introduced them. And so sometime after she got pregnant, they got married. She divorced Alan, of course, but Alan Tietz is his name. But then they moved to Seneca County, New York, Seneca Falls, where Karl is from. And at some point, they had this incident with a car they just bought. He said that they were smelling like smoke coming from it and that there was a lot of indicators that something was wrong with it. But oddly enough, when the car caught on fire, it was actually parked outside the house with everything taken out of it. So like the children's car seats, everything was removed from the vehicle when it caught on fire. And obviously that was a little weird, but he got his insurance policy off of that. I'm not sure if he profited in any way, but he did get insurance from that.
Right.
So then we have the situation with the insurance policies on him and his wife and his two kids. So just a couple of weeks before the fire happened in 1991, he walks in to the State Farm Insurance Agency in Murphy's and requests that he wants life insurance policies taken out on his wife. And it goes back and forth a little bit on what happened with the kids and if he upped the insurance policies. It's not quite clear there. But essentially what happened was that he took out $100,000 on each of his three kids and $200,000 on himself and Christina. And originally, according to the agents at State Farm, he didn't want to take out a policy on his own life. He said he was already covered, and he changed his story a few times. It was through the military, through work, but he couldn't produce proof of that insurance. And they have a law, or a policy through State Farm, which I think is a good policy, is that you can't take out insurance on somebody else if you're not insured yourself.
Right.
So the only reason he got insurance to begin with was because they required him to do that. And so, yeah, he has the insurance policies on himself, his wife, and his kids. And an interesting story that one of the investigators for State Farm told during her testimony, her name's Heather Gower Small. I think she had one of the most interesting testimonies during the whole trial. She talked about how very shortly before the fire happened, Christina came into the office to sign some paperwork. And at that time, Karl wasn't there, but she requested... she filled out paperwork to have the kids' insurance policies put under her name. So she would be the owner of the policies, meaning she would control what happens with those policies.
Okay.
And so, I don't know, to me that meant a lot. I don't know if Karl knew about it. I don't know if that played into the fact that the kids survived at all. I really don't know. But she also said that in talking to neighbors, she heard yelling, like the neighbors said they heard altercations coming from the house in the days leading up to the fire. I don't know if it had anything to do with that, but, you know, there's also talk of a divorce might have been imminent. I can't say where I've heard that from a few different places. I don't know if that's true, but that was all being talked about. So yeah, we have $200,000 on Christina. And State Farm did their investigation. Heather Gower Small recommended that they do not pay him because she straight up said, I think he killed his wife. When asked by the defense why she thought that was the case, besides all the stuff she thought was suspicious, like what Ken Buskey found in his investigation of the second pour of kerosene, besides the fact that it only was a matter of weeks until the insurance policy was actually taken out,
Right.
to when the claim was filed. Besides all of that, she also measured the distance from the ground to the window that Christina was stuck in that bathroom. She measured the distance from the window to the ground and saw it was about 6 feet. And then she's pretty tall, but she could reach it from the porch. And so her theory was, why didn't, there was a pickaxe lying right nearby. Why didn't Karl just try to get her out? It wasn't that high up. She also thought that Chris should have been able to pull the board off, but we can talk more about that later. So there are a whole bunch of reasons, and then she was asked by the defense, like, okay, besides Ken Buskey's testimony, all of that stuff, if that's not true, why did you think that he killed his wife? Is that enough to say a man killed his wife? And she said, because of Karl Karlsen. Like, just, she got to fly. It's funny that the government didn't pay for the local investigators to fly out to New York to interrogate him. That's sort of where this whole thing got shut down, was that Cal Fire and the DA's office back in 1991 wouldn't give them funding to fly out to New York. But State Farm did. So she flew out, she talked to Karl, and, during that interview, she said he got upset at a couple times and banged on the table, and she just, like, the interview didn't go well in her mind. It didn't bode well for him. And so, like I said, a lot of this was just a trial of personality and what he does and what his pattern is.
Yeah.
So moving past the house fire, in between Christina's death and her son Levi's death, we have the barn fire. And that was in 2002. And what happened with that, and I won't go too much into that, but I mean, all you need to know is, like, he got $114,000 from that barn fire and the 3 horses that died inside. So during that 8-hour interrogation about Levi's death with the New York investigators, he brings up the barn fire just of his own, he brings it up. And the funny thing about Karl is that what I've observed, I don't know if this is true, but from what I've observed, he seems to focus on the things that he's lying about. He talks more about the things that he's wanting to cover up. That's just what I've seen. So he, however many hours into this investigation, he starts to boast about his Belgian draft horses that he raised and how he had the largest Belgian draft horse mare in the country and how great she was. And then he mentioned, and he's just on a monologue at this point, and then he mentions how she foundered. And if you know anything about horses, if a horse founders, that's usually it for the horse. That's a death sentence. And even the investigators ask him that. They say, oh, well, what do you do when a horse founders? He's like, oh, you shoot it. I'm like, okay. And he's like, but she died in a barn fire.
So
okay.
He brought the fire up.
And so
on
then the
his own.
investigators are like, oh, let's talk more about this then. This seems like a good thing to talk about. Yeah, and so then, and I even have a quote from him, and then he says, but, luckily everything was okay with her. I had 20,000 on her because she was one of a kind. That's what he says to the investigators. So everything was okay. And he also mentions at one point before that, they're thinking about his dad was ready to get rid of the horses and they were ready to close that chapter, and they upped the insurance policies on the barn and the horses right before the fire happened. So that was just another thing that was sort of, he'd never been charged with anything before.
Right.
The investigators had no reason to think it wasn't an accident. And then moving to Levi's death and the insurance policy on his life. And it's pretty agreed upon at this point that they didn't get along. He said he was kind of into goth culture, and he had kids at that point. Levi had 2 young children with a really young wife. He was 23 at the time he died. But he'll tell you, too, that he was really starting to turn his life around. He'd gotten a job at the local, the glass factory that Karl worked at. And he said, I was really proud of him. He's turning his life around. But through his job, Levi got an insurance policy. And Karl said that Levi wanted to make Karl the sole beneficiary because he was having problems with his ex-wife at that time, or ex-girlfriend. I don't remember if they were married. And he wanted that money to go to his daughters, and he didn't want her to get her hands on that money. That's what Karl said. So he made Karl the sole beneficiary hoping, with the promise, rather, that Karl would take care of his kids with that money. Mind you, he's 23 years old at this time.
Right.
And Karl knew about that, and he also knew that there was an increase on the policy if there was an accidental death. I think it was like $50,000 or something like that.
And all this, like how I mentioned that Christina couldn't come up in Levi's trial. This all came up in the trial, Levi and everything in the insurance policy for Christina's trial?
Yeah, so Karl even told me that when we met that first couple times, he said it was very clear that he thought this trial would just be a rehashing of his previous conviction. And in a way, he saw that as an opportunity. He even said he wanted to represent himself at one point. He thought he was pretty well versed in the law and wanted to represent himself. He saw it as an opportunity to overturn his previous conviction, as outlandish as that may seem. And I know he's appealing it right now, but so yeah, and all of that stuff was brought up during this trial, and that interrogation with the Seneca County, New York police. During that interrogation, even though it was back in 2012, they asked him a ton of questions about the barn fire too. And so in a way that was sort of like in lieu of his, like if Karl would have testified, like we got to hear everything he would have said in that 8-hour interview.
Mm-hmm. Right. So before we get back into the dresser, because I find that really interesting, there's a phone call you wanted to talk about that happened.
Yeah, so this was touched on very briefly during the trial. It never got mentioned again because it got shut down by the defense pretty quickly. I don't quite understand it because I'm not in law, I'm not an attorney, but they tend to, if there's anything talking about like what was said during a conversation, like a phone conversation, they seem to argue hearsay a lot of the time.
Okay.
And that's what they did in this case. So when Jackie Karlsen, that's Karl Karlsen, that's his sister-in-law.
Okay.
And she's just one of the many family members, even on his side, to testify against him during this trial. His brother, Mike Karlsen, also testified against him. So Jackie Karlsen was pretty close to Christina, she said. They got really close while they were living in Seneca County, New York. And she was also very close with Karl and Christina's kids. And she started to say that a matter of days, or she said shortly before the house fire, she had a phone conversation with Christina. And she started to say that she was afraid to die in a fire. When asked what the contents of that conversation was, she said she was afraid to die in a fire, and then she got cut off really quickly. So we don't really know what she was going to say. As far as I know, Jackie's never been interviewed by anyone. She wasn't on Dateline or 2020 or anything like that. Mike Karlsen was, but that was just something that really stuck out to me.
But it's interesting because she did say it she was on the witness stand and said this. Mm-hmm. So it's like one of those things, even though the defense can break it down and say it's hearsay, and then the judge could say, you need to disregard that. The jury already heard that from her.
They did. And I already heard it, and I wrote it down.
Right. Yeah. It's like one of those things that some things can just not be reversed once you hear it.
Yeah. And that's why I would assume, whoever has someone on the stand, whether it's the prosecution in this case, they would still keep asking those questions, knowing that they would get shut down, just to see how much they can get away with. And that was one of those cases. I haven't heard it mentioned since. I don't know where she was going with that, but she did say she was afraid to die in a fire.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So now getting to the dresser, when you first read your thing, I was making mental points of little things, which we've talked about throughout. And one thing I found really interesting was Erin's testimony about how the dresser was under her window or at the window when it's usually in the closet. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that because that's odd to me.
Yeah. So I guess to talk about this, you'd have to talk about what someone can remember almost 30 years after it happened,
True. Especially
if they were only 6 years old at the time. It makes me wonder what she was remembering from her own memory and what she was told by Karl, because she spent the rest of her childhood life with just Karl as her only parent, if you don't count Cindy Best. But so some of the things that stuck out to me with that is when she talks about hearing her mom screaming, she said that she heard her say, Karl get the kids. And whether that happened or not, that's exactly what Karl says Christina screamed as well. And part of me, when I heard that, thought, well, maybe it's true, or maybe she's been told this her whole life and it's a false memory to some degree. But I don't want to pick apart her testimony too much. I think everyone takes that with a grain of salt. What she did say about the dresser, like you said, was that she thought it was strange that she found the dresser in front of the window, as it usually was in their closet. And she did also say that they had received new furniture for Christmas that year. So they just gotten new beds. And I don't think the dresser was involved in that, but she did say that they were excited that they got their new beds. Yeah, and she just remembers, as far as I remember from her testimony, she remembers calling for her father, like calling for help. And then Karl shows up and smashes through a window and pushes the dresser aside and pulls him out.
So the dresser was blocking the window?
Yes, so she said that for her height at the time, she tried to get out through the window, but the dresser was actually blocking the window. Yeah, she couldn't get up on top of it. Mm-hmm. I don't know how tall it was, but she was too short at the time to get on top of it. And then Karl breaks through, and she said, I think, pushes the dresser aside from outside the window.
Okay. Yeah, it's just odd that it was there. Yeah.
I think that's one of those things she says, there are some things you forget, but there are some things you remember. And I know that Karl probably didn't tell her that dresser was, and I'm sure she remembers him pushing it out of the way. Mm-hmm. So that is something that I would take pretty seriously in her testimony.
Yeah. Some weird things you can remember, even at my old age. I can still remember, probably not 6 to 15 are probably all meshed together, but I do have vivid memories. But at the same time, could I have been changing my memories in my head? You never know. So
yeah. I mean, I would imagine if it was the one thing blocking her from getting out the window, she would remember it.
Yeah.
So one of the major points that the prosecution tried to drive home in their closing argument was that Karl had essentially lied about what happened when he was saving the kids. In most of his stories, when he's being interrogated about it, he'll say, and this is what he told me too, he will say that he saved Levi first, and he had to smash through the window, and there was a huge fireball that hit him in the face and singed his eyebrows and stuff. And he had to pull up Levi by his hair down under the window, and then he got blown back across the port. It was just, like I said before, with Karl, I tend to believe that he focuses on things that he's not telling the truth about. So whatever he talks about the most is what you should probably focus on the most, because that's probably where the untruth is. So that was a story that he told over and over, but the prosecution focused on one of the witnesses who testified pretty early on. His name was James Roberts, and I think he was just a family friend. And he showed up at the hospital in the hours after the fire and said that Karl initially told him that he was saving the girls and Levi just showed up next to him. Showed up. Didn't say anything about a fireball or breaking through his window or anything like that. And then you look at Erin DeRoche's testimony, his daughter, and she said that Karl retrieved them first and they were waiting in the truck, and then Karl comes back with Levi. So one thing the prosecution tried to do was to show kind of how preposterous it was that he would break through the window and a fireball would hit him, and that he would that would go right over Levi's head and he'd manage to grab him. And it does sound pretty preposterous.
Yeah.
So their theory that they tried to drive home was that Levi essentially saved his sisters, that he had those $100,000 insurance policies on each of his children, and he intended to kill them all. And because Levi made it out of the house by himself and showed up next to Karl and was watching, Karl had no choice but to save Erin and Katie.
Wow. So with all this, it was a 3-week trial, and then the jury was sent out to deliberate. And how long were they out for?
So the jury was out for approximately 8 hours. So on Friday, I believe they let us out, and then we had half a day waiting. I know people were not taking bets, but they were definitely conjecturing as to how long it would take. And most people thought it would be, and I was talking to people like writers like Aphrodite Jones and the Dateline staff and all those people, and they were saying, well, it's probably going to take like 2 hours maybe. They thought it was just done. But it didn't. It made me pretty nervous. It took 8 hours, so they took, half of Friday, and they took some of Monday after that.
There's always that theory that goes along with it where if it's short, they're convicted. If it takes longer, they're innocent. And then those things are kind of, the last couple of trials I've kind of studied, that seems to just blow out of the water. They're usually convicted,
Yeah.
and it took like 10 days to deliberate. But I don't think that it's like flipping a coin kind of style.
Yeah. So I just did an interview with an alternate juror a couple days ago, and he had some insight as to what happened there just from what he was told after the fact by other jurors. He said that there was one holdout, and that person was mostly influenced by juror instructions. I mean, I could see how that could happen. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence here, and that was something in jury selection that they tried to focus on a lot was, do you understand what circumstantial evidence is? Do you realize its importance? And, and so forth. So he said there was one holdout, but then he said it would have probably taken much shorter, like a way shorter amount of time. But Super Bowl Sunday was that weekend. And they were a little bit nervous, I guess, that, and this is all what he told me. I don't know if this is true. And he wasn't in that room, so we can't know for sure what happened, just to be clear. But he thinks that the fact that Super Bowl Sunday was coming, they didn't want to seem like they didn't take long enough time on it. They didn't want to seem like they were rushing to get to their weekend.
Okay.
And so he just said they were just extra careful and meticulous with the paperwork that they had and just took their time. And then it ended up taking 8 hours, but he said it wouldn't have otherwise.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting, but at the same time, if I was part of this, I can hardly ever make a decision of when we're doing the podcast. It's like, I don't know if this guy's guilty, and it has like all the evidence laid out. I'm just so scared.
Yeah.
It's like being a jury. This is a murder trial, and you're putting your judgment on someone else's rest of their life. So I think it would be hard.
Yeah.
I can understand the holdout, but going by directions also, that makes sense to me.
It's
and
important.
it's just, it would be scary. But 8 hours, I mean, 8 hours can feel like you've talked for 3 weeks if you're talking about the same thing. So
the reason why it made me nervous that it took so long, and the only other murder trial I've covered, I really wasn't that sure. I was thinking if I were a juror on this jury, what would I decide? And it was a little bit more gray to me. But with this one, it made me nervous because at the end of the day, it was like, you believe Karl or you don't. Because it was his personality, it was his pattern of behavior. There wasn't a lot of physical evidence left. It was either you see that it all adds up or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't a lot, like, you could go through and analyze every single little thing over 13 days of the trial, but that would just kind of lead you down this rabbit hole. And it was really either like it adds up, his story adds up, or it doesn't.
Right.
And you even couldn't say that because he changed his story so many times. And the most important thing that, when I talked to that alternate juror, he said, the defense was acting like it was kind of overkill and over the top that we should have to listen to almost 8 hours of this interrogation with him, but I think that was absolutely necessary. I think we got a really good feel for who he is, because during that interrogation he changes his story 2 times. He confesses, and the thing that you see in that interrogation is that there's really no difference between, if you believe he was telling the truth before, no matter what you believe the truth was, there's no difference between Karl telling the truth and not telling the truth. You find that he says it all indifferently. And that was really important. So, so to me, it was making me nervous that it was taking that long because I thought, what is there to deliberate about? Either you believe him or you don't.
Right.
Yeah. Another insightful, another piece of insight that I got from this alternate juror when I interviewed him, I I don't want to say excited, but kind of relieved to hear it because it answered a question that I'd been sort of randomly asking people who were involved with the trial for a long time. I asked the producer of Dateline, who'd been covering the whole case for years. I just kept asking everyone who knew anything about the case, why does Karl Karlsen focus so much on his wife not being a drinker? This was something that came up a lot during my conversations with him. And like I said, he just sort of focuses on the things that are completely true in his whatever he talks about the most, I think there has to be a reason for it, and you should look there. So that was something he kept saying. When Christina was found, when her body was found, she had a blood alcohol content of 0.07%, which is fairly high. I've heard that sometimes when someone dies, especially in a fire, it can raise your BAC.
That's interesting. I'd never heard that before.
I don't know. I don't know if that's completely true.
Right, yeah.
Someone told Karl that too, because that's what he's latched onto, is that she didn't drink anything. But I have heard that during other trials too, is that when you die, sometimes your BAC can get higher. So she was found with a 0.07 BAC, and he insisted multiple times, even though no one was asking, that Christina wasn't a drinker. She never drank. I can't believe that. That's ridiculous. And he said this in a couple different interrogations and just always focusing on it. And I was thinking, why is this a problem? Why does he keep coming back to this? And so this alternate juror pointed out that he basically thinks that Carlson had her drink on New Year's Day. He had her drink on purpose so she would be tipsy. When she went to take a bath, she might fall asleep. And there is evidence for that because one of the family friends who Karl talked to in the hours after the fire testified that he told her that Christina had gone to take a bath with a glass of wine.
Okay.
I believe it was the same person. I'm not positive, but there's another friend who said that one time during a party, she had offered Christina some alcohol, like a glass of wine or something, and Karl answered for her, no, she'll have a soda. So I asked this alternate juror that. I said, hey, do you think she was a closet drinker? I mean, I would be a closet drinker if I was married to that man. Like, there's no shame in that.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I think that he coaxed her into drinking and got her tipsy for that day. And then another thing that he brought up that made a lot of sense to me was the other answer to that lingering question that I think everyone had at the end of that trial is, why didn't she try to pull the board off of the window? Because the State Farm investigator said she didn't think it would be that difficult. It seemed like she should have been able to pull it off. It was only nailed into the drywall. In the video footage that we see from Jan Starr and Ellie Nessler, she's kind of pulling on the board a little bit. It's only about like a half inch, maybe. It seems like if you were trying to fight for your life, you'd be able to pull that thing off.
Right.
So what we in the courtroom didn't get to see that the jury did was the picture of Christina's body when she was found. And oddly enough, she was found by one of our county supervisors, Dennis Mills, who was a volunteer firefighter at the time. But he testified to this, and they showed the jury the picture. And what the alternate juror told me was that in that photo, she was kind of like hunched down in the bathtub. Some say she was like half in, half out, and she had a washcloth held over her face. And he said, why on earth would she do that unless someone was telling her to do that? And so his theory is that Karl was yelling from the outside, get down in the tub, put the washcloth over your face, I'll get to you. And that she was coached to stay in that bathtub. And she did die of smoke inhalation. The bathroom itself was never really badly burnt.
Yeah.
It was really just the smoke that got her. But to me, I don't know if that's true, but that made a lot of sense to me as to why she would have stayed in the bathtub and put the cloth over her face.
I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting that that's the theory of the alternate juror, because in any situation, I mean, maybe not any situation. I was kind of got obsessed with the MGM Grand fire that happened in 81 in Las Vegas, but a lot of people were doing that, putting the washcloth over they would wet it and put it over their face. But it could just be that she was there thinking someone's going to come get her instead of coaching. And that, if she's yelling out, save the kids, she could have just been waiting and trying to bide her time with that. I don't know if he could have been yelling. I mean, it's all theory, but it could just be that she was also just hoping someone would be there soon.
Yeah. I mean, either way, it doesn't really look good for him because, well, he was also a volunteer firefighter when he was younger, which is kind of an interesting piece of information.
So he could have taught her that in the future too, then.
He could have, and that's just something you would know of, maybe. I mean, if you don't think there's a way out and you think that's the best, and like you said, if you think someone's coming to get you,
right?
Maybe it wasn't a matter of coaching, it was a matter of, don't worry, I'm going to come get you.
Right. Just instinct, like, someone's going to come get me. I'm gonna be here.
But if she would have opened that door and looked into the hallway, like I would, if the handle wasn't too hot, she would have just seen flames in front of her.
But would she, from the investigation, could she have done that? Could it have happened, or would that show like burn patterns or something like that?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would assume that the door handle would be so hot at that point that you wouldn't be able to touch it. So and there would have been smoke coming in through the cracks of the door. But I mean, either way, the window was only 6 feet or so off the ground. So the fact that, and there was also a pickaxe lying nearby. So either way, if I were Christina, I would have assumed that my husband was coming for me. I would think.
Hope. Yeah.
I would hope. Especially if I was hunkering down in the tub like that with a washcloth, you have to believe that someone's coming for you. But yeah, no matter how it plays out, it doesn't look good for Karl.
Right.
Because
and I think it's just so hard. I think human nature to speculate how this could have, should have played out. And then you don't really know. You're hearing from someone who's been convicted, their side, and you're not hearing, or kids, you're not hearing Christina's story. It's just hard. And I understand people want to, they need clarity sometimes or closure in their own, even if they're not part of the case, even though they've been sitting there for 3 weeks as in the trial. But you kind of make speculations, and it's just hard, like what it is. But it's an interesting theory that he was coaching outside and just had it all, this whole plan, which he could have easily.
It's a theory at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's just, but I think we all make them. So,
yeah. And it shows you what mindset she might have been in at the time.
Right. And this was a first-degree murder case?
Yes.
And then when they came back, they found him guilty, right?
They did.
Okay. And then so sentencing is going to be March 17th, correct?
March 17th.
And then if you want, because I'm hoping that you'll hear this before the sentencing, but Dakota has a website that you can follow that she'll have updates and everything if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. So for updates on this trial, I would want to direct you to the CalaverasEnterprise.com because that's where I work and that's where I do all of my coverage of trials. But I also have a personal website that I upload a lot of true crime and the Motherlode articles that I write for the Calaveras Enterprise, but with credit to them. And so if you want to kind of get a feel for, it's called Murder in the Motherlode, you can see all those articles there. I also have a book that I wrote in the past that I'm uploading chapter by chapter. That's about my time in the Middle East and my experiences and my experience with a terrorist attack in Nice, France. If you find that at all interesting, I think it's good for people who might be thinking about traveling abroad for school, anything like that. I'm also hoping to start a series on there really soon about death and the death industry. And it sounds really morbid, I know, but I think it's an important topic that we all think about and worry about. And I'd like it to be sort of a lighthearted, insightful approach at how we handle death in our culture and alternatives. So yeah, if you want to read more, you can check that out. It's DakotaMorlan.com, DakotaMorlan.com.
All right. We hope to have you back soon. Hopefully not for a horrible trial, but maybe once you get that going, we can talk about what you're writing about there. And then, yeah, this is This has been insightful. I'm glad. I don't know too much about journalism. I don't know too much about how.
Neither do I.
Yeah,
I'm figuring it out as it goes.
But it's really nice to have someone who's been through a trial and get to know how the steps go and everything like that. And so I really thank you for coming on, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll hear from you soon, I guess.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, everyone.